Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Thoughts with Nick. Today's quote comes from George Santayana, and what he said was, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." George Santayana was a philosopher from the early 1900s, and personally, I never really heard of him. I'm not familiar with his work or any of his ideas, really, but I've heard a kind of derivative form of this quote countless times over the years, and the version that I'm familiar with is, if you don't know the past, you're doomed to repeat it. And if I had to guess, you've probably heard this quote as well. I think it's pretty common and well known, but I always thought it was kind of interesting, and I want to talk about that topic today. So I looked up that quote so I could find out who said it initially when I was preparing for this video, and I was surprised to learn that it wasn't that common form that we all know, but it is just a little different. But anyway, the point of the quote here is that you need to learn from the past, and like I said, that's exactly what I want to talk about today. When it comes to learning from the past, I think there's a couple different ways you can think about it, mainly just the part and the whole, so to speak. And the part is just the individual. That's you learning from your own past, or you learning from history in general. And then the whole is the collective, the world's population learning from the world's past. And today I want to start by focusing on the individualistic side. So just how can you learn from your past and make yourself a better person as a result of it? So while you go through life, I think it's pretty important to take some time to stop and reflect about where you're at and how you got there, the choices and decisions that you made, and whether or not you're happy with the results of these choices and actions that you made that got you to where you're at. If you take some time to think about it and think about things have gone and how your choices influence these outcomes, especially in regard to your place in life, I think you can learn a lot from the choices that you've made and how they led to where you are. For example, if you're not happy with your job, you can do some more targeted, isolated reflection on how you ended up in that position, how you ended up with that company, why did you take that job, what set you on that career path, and why are you ultimately unhappy. You can narrow your focus down, and if you do some introspection, I think you'll be able to determine, based on your own personal history of decision making, how you got there, and then maybe you can try and adjust or pivot and not fall into those same pitfalls or traps or whatever mistakes that you made the previous time when you were looking for a job. And my point here is that with anything, but just this example too, taking time to think about those key questions, it's going to shine some light on how you ended up in that position, and for better or worse, you're going to gain some serious awareness about how you got there. And like I said, I think that could be applied to everything. If you're honest with yourself, and if you explore similar lines of thinking to what I just kind of was exploring in relation to the jobs, if you explore similar lines of thinking to your past, you're probably going to be able to determine the how and why to your position and status in life. And I think the awareness is just step one, though. Awareness of how you got to where you are ensures that you're no longer ignorant or oblivious within your own life. So you're on the first step. Like I said, awareness is step one. And once you're aware of how you got into that position, the next step is understanding, and then by extension, learning. Understanding takes awareness a step further because it entails a causal realization rather of how past events led to today. Going back to my former conversation, this is not to be taken in a deterministic sense, but rather the real sense that all past events led to today. What I mean is that in this present moment, there might have been other choices available that, if chosen, would have created a different result, but the realized choices and resultant outcomes are inherently responsible for the current circumstances. When you understand how your choices overlapped and led to one another and influenced one another and maybe even prevented other choices from being available, you can start to learn from your past. And that, like I said, that's taking that awareness a step further through understanding into learning. I think understanding and learning, they occupy the same step, because when you gain that understanding, by default, you end up learning. Understanding leads to learning directly. And to me, I don't see how you could gain an understanding without learning. When you've been able to understand and learn from your past, you can use your experience and knowledge to better influence and control your future. And one of the keys here that's gained through the understanding is that causal realization that I mentioned. Understanding and knowledge of how certain choices created certain outcomes will allow you to either avoid or replicate those choices depending on whether or not the outcome was satisfactory to you. If you weren't happy with the result, you know which choices led you there. So if you're in a similar situation, you can be sure not to repeat yourself and fall into those same traps. But on the flip side, if you were happy with the result and you find yourself in a similar situation, then you know what worked before and you know how you achieved the result that you were happy with. So you can just follow in your own footsteps. This understanding and knowledge is going to prevent you from making the same mistakes and actually ensures that you learn from your mistakes. And I think this will kind of make that path to your dream future a little easier because you're actually ascending up the staircase of goal setting, just to kind of drop a couple of my past videos right there. But you're just kind of climbing up that staircase one step at a time rather than hitting the same roadblocks and pitfalls and getting knocked back down by the same thing time and time again. You're actually making progress. In addition to the causal realization, there's another way that individuals can learn from their past too, which is pattern recognition. When you look at your past and reflect, and you look at it on the aggregate, you might start to notice some parallels or trends or reoccurrences over time. And I think this can easily clue you into some underlying themes or patterns in your life. One example could be decision making when risk is involved. Maybe when you look back at your past, you'll notice that you frequently or maybe even always choose the safest option, taking a more risk-averse strategy just to ensure that you don't get hurt, you don't get burned. And if you aren't happy with your place in life, maybe next time you end up in a situation like that where you have a choice between novelty or sameness, maybe this time you'll be compelled to take the risk instead of the safe option because you know that you played it safe before and it didn't really end up the way you wanted to in the long run. And the same could be true on the other side. Maybe when you look at your past, you notice that you're a pretty bold risk taker, but you got burned sometimes and it didn't turn out in your favor. So if you want to kind of hedge against getting burnt in the future, you can learn from those situations where you did get hurt and play it a little safe in the future if there's something similar that comes up. Obviously, those are just kind of two big, broad examples about fundamental decision-making processes, but there's tons of smaller themes and trends that you can pick up on your life by analyzing your past. It takes some time, some introspection, but there's definitely something there if you can determine what your frequent decisions are and how you make choices and what is kind of like a motivating factor for you in your decision-making process. Learning from your past, whether it's the causal realization or pattern recognition, amounts to nothing without thoughtful implementation. It's crucial that when you gain this awareness and then the understanding and resultant knowledge, that you put it into effect in your life in order to reach your dream future on an expedited timeline. And I think an easy way to put this information into use is in repeated situations like I mentioned. As I've gotten older, there's been a few instances in my life that it's not quite like deja vu, but they're very reminiscent of things that happened to me when I was younger. Just the details are slightly different or the timeline's slightly different. And I'm sure if you reflect on your own life, there's probably some instances like that too, where there's certain things that were just so similar, it's kind of uncanny, but it's just that kind of stuff happens. I don't know. As you get older, I feel like you'll start to notice it. But anyway, it's not always really obvious in the moment. That's something that I've struggled with, is like I can look back and in retrospect say, wow, those events were really pretty almost exactly the same, but in the moment it just didn't occur, didn't cross my mind that I had been in a situation just like this before. And I think it's hard to notice and catch it in the moment, but if you've been practicing that self-reflection and you have that understanding and knowledge of your past already at your disposal, you're going to be thrilled. You're going to be so happy you get to encounter these situations again because you noticed it in the moment and now you have a tutorial on what to do or what not to do. You can use your past like a book. You can flip right back to that chapter where you had a similar experience and you can use it like your cheat sheet. If you know how things went in the past and if you've kind of studied your own past, you can use your personal history textbook to guide your decision making and just make the best possible choices, minimizing the amount of mistakes that you make because you already made them in the past. You don't need to make them again. You can learn and improve and move forward in life. And once you're aware of your patterns and actions and your choices too, for that matter, you can use these discoveries to your advantage. You'll understand what causes what, like where do certain choices come from and where do different paths end up. You can understand how your responses and reactions might trigger their own responses and reactions in other people, and you can adjust your actions accordingly. If you don't want to upset someone and you've noticed, this is that pattern recognition, you've noticed when you say XYZ to them, whether or not they say it to your face, you can tell it bothers them. So next time, even though maybe you don't deem it to be offensive, you cut that out of your vocabulary when you speak with them, whatever that may be. I actually feel like that wasn't the best example, but I think you probably get my point. Anyway, understanding your response to different situations and stimuli, you can choose to either lean into your tendencies or you can choose to go against them. And I think it's just all about understanding what each situation calls for. You can use your nature to your advantage, or you can use your understanding of your nature to your advantage by preventing yourself from making mistakes or acting irrationally. As with a lot of my topics, having a knowledge of self goes a long way here, and it's easier said than done, but it's definitely worth your while. And even with that understanding of your tendencies, it can be difficult to be conscious and aware in the moment and catch yourself before your nature gets in the way. But if you don't have any knowledge or understanding of self, it's going to be impossible to kind of like prevent your nature from hurting you unconsciously, if that makes sense. I personally think that your inherent nature and tendencies are likely strengths for the most part, or they can be used as strengths if you kind of think outside the box, and they probably have a lot of benefits when they're harnessed and used to your advantage. But at the same time, they can be pitfalls. And something this reminds me of, it's not the same, but there's this Greek idea called hamartia, which is, it's considered to be fatal fall. It's kind of like a rough translation. It's just like the hero in the myth or the story or whatever, they have something that is what elevates them to that hero status, some awesome, awe-inspiring capability or whatever, like borderline superpower, and then in the end it causes their downfall because they didn't envision their own weakness, so to speak, because of this major advantage that they had. And that's kind of what I think our nature can be viewed as well sometimes. Like it can be a major advantage, but if you don't know how to shelve it, so to speak, when the situation calls for it, it can put you in a bad spot. And I don't know. That's just what I think, and it reminded me of that idea that I've heard of from some of the ancient Greek stuff. But in addition to learning from your own personal past and using it to your advantage, I think that as a collective society, country, world, whatever, we all need to do a better job of paying attention to the past and learning from things that have happened in the past. And if I go back to that quote that I mentioned at the beginning, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. It literally sounds like a curse, like the whole world is being cursed. If you don't know the past, then you're going to repeat it again. It sounds so ominous and like impending disaster. And I think when you look at history in the past in general, there's so much to learn there. So it is almost like a curse if we choose not to learn from it, and we choose to almost by default end up making those same mistakes because of our refusal or intentional ignorance or denial of the past. But I don't know. I think that definitely it could be viewed as it. It just reminds me of something you'd hear on some TV show or something, some witch's curse. Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. It just sounds funny, but sure enough, it's definitely true. My point here that I want to get back to, I guess I kind of went on a tangent a little bit about that quote, is there's so much to learn from the past, and we have over thousands of years of history, but especially the past few hundred years since the printing press has been invented. There's so much information at our disposal that we can use to learn from and understand how different situations led to different outcomes. And studying the past, I think, will allow for a really good a thorough understanding of cause and effect of historic events, and I think by being committed students of history, we would be much more prepared to avoid the pitfalls and mistakes of previous generations when similar situations inevitably occur, because they always do. Similar stuff, it's not going to be the same. The details won't be exactly the same, but there's going to be noticeable parallels and similarities in current events and in famous historical events. That's just the way things seem to go. I don't know. And you can feel free to look it up if you don't agree with me. I don't really feel the need to go into examples at length, but there's all kind of stuff where there's just, like I said before, uncanny parallels to other events throughout the ages. But anyway, if we're all more aware and cognizant of these events and history as it occurred, we can collectively move towards a better future, learning from the mistakes of our predecessors. And I'm a little bit off topic here again. I've been going on a couple tangents in this video, I'll admit, but this is where I think history could align really well with social sciences and the consilience of sorts. And I think that idea right there deserves more attention than it gets. Because if we were able to obtain a deep understanding of how certain conditions created certain outcomes in the past, then we could actively prevent underlying causes. We could get to the root of the problem, and we could prevent the resultant disaster, whatever that may be, from ever occurring, because we eliminated the cause before it reached that critical level that the pot boils over and it's no longer recoverable and whatever tragedy is inevitable. We could, if we had that social understanding of cause and effect on a societal level, then we could seriously implement some change to avoid some of the more devastating and tragic things that have happened throughout history. Even if on a societal level, though, we continue to ignore the past, you as an individual can still try and learn from it, just for your own personal benefit. You don't have to think about trying to inform others if they don't want to listen. It is what it is. A lot of people don't, a lot of people won't, and that's okay. It's not a knock on them. That's just the reality of the situation. Everyone's different, and that's fine if you're not interested in that. It's just is my personal opinion that if as a society we were all a little more aware of what's going on in the past, the mistakes and everything like that, then we could move forward better. But anyway, just like I mentioned before about like avoiding the steps, or avoiding mistakes rather, preventing mistakes as a society, you can prevent yourself from personal bad outcomes just by having knowledge of the past. And one example that comes to mind right away is with investing. If you invest, you can prevent yourself from taking major losses just by being aware of historic market failures. Like a couple really great obvious examples of things that led to severe economic downturns, like the time period leading up to the Great Depression and then leading up to the recession of 2008. Two of those right there. I know before that it was the Roaring Twenties before the Great Depression, and then before the recession of 2008, the early 2000s was a really economically profitable time, I guess you could say. And then even recently you could look at the tariffs and how that really shook up the market. And you can just kind of be aware of, like, for the first two, what goes up must come down kind of thing. Like if the market's doing great, you might want to kind of do some profit taking kind of thing just to insulate yourself. And then with the tariffs, like if you hear something like that's coming down again, pull your money out, and you won't get burned. But anyway, that was just an example that comes to mind right away of how being a student of history, you can prevent yourself from like major loss taking if you're an investor type. I don't know. That's just something that seemed kind of obvious to me. But being cognizant of the actions and decisions and policies and whatever else kind of led there, you'll be able to recognize the signs again in the moment. And like I said, even if society as a whole won't pay attention and do better, you can protect yourself as an individual. And there's other examples too. One that just comes to mind as well, it's health related. I just saw a thing recently. It was 30 years ago, I think 31 actually, in the mid 90s, a bunch of, I think it was 7 different tobacco companies, CEOs or C-suite people, whatever, it doesn't really matter. They testified under oath to Congress that they did not believe nicotine was addictive. And that's laughable. That's absolutely ridiculous. There's no way you could be an executive from a tobacco company and not think that nicotine was addictive. And it just goes to show how far companies will go to lie just to make money, even when they know what they're selling is not helping people, it's actually hurting them. It's a cause of major problems. It's addictive. It's all these other things. It just shows that money is the major motivator rather than the actual health and wellness of your fellow human being. So you have to be aware of that and take your health into your own hands. And kind of taking that a step further, extrapolating that, just think about how food companies market, and they know the stuff that they're selling is really, really bad for you, but they market it in a way that makes it seem so desirable, so delicious. You need it, you love it, whatever. And all the time they're just making money off of you without a care in the world for how their product ends up affecting you in the long term. So this is just kind of like a couple examples, first the economic one and then the health related one, of how if you're aware of history and the big picture history kind of thing, like how companies, governments, corporations, whatever, will manipulate individuals for their own personal gain, you can make sure you're not the one that falls victim to that. You're not the one that ends up getting hurt, because you recognize the signs and you'll be able to look out for yourself in a much better fashion. And there's another reason that I think people should really study history too, and that's for inspirational purposes. I think no matter what your goals or interests are, if you look back through history, you're probably going to be able to find someone who is at the pinnacle of what it is that you want to do or what you care about. And you can focus on them and learn from that person and learn from their life story and try and emulate how they got there. Try and not make the same mistakes they made and just try and follow in their footsteps on the path to success. I think it's really inspiring and it's helpful to have someone in history, a historical figure, who maybe they paved a way for a new line of thinking. Maybe they made some groundbreaking technological advance. I think it's really important that we look up at and admire these people, because it shows how much is achievable. It shows how much you can do when you're really driven and you're really committed and you're really willing. And sometimes things like that can seem really unattainable until you have an example, a tangible, real example of this person who went out and did it, and they achieved their dreams from a situation that seemed like the furthest thing from where they ended up being. And I think it's really important that people look back and find almost a historic role model of sorts that they can look up to and say, I want to be like that person. They did it their way. They got it right. Their morals, their ideals, whatever, something about them that you want to emulate. And you have that example of someone who did what it is that you wanted to do. It shows you that it's real. It shows you that it is in fact attainable and that you can live your dream. I think it's really important to find someone who did it first, and then you have that guideline for success. You just have to put your own spin on it to get to where you want to be. And additionally, knowing who came before you and how they got there is going to allow you to kind of incorporate some of their achievements and their thoughts into your own efforts, once again making use of history and using it to your advantage. I think concerning history on the whole, it should kind of be a matter of principle to have a better knowledge of the past than to be ignorant. In general, it's just going to enable you to make more informed decisions when you apply the knowledge in your daily life. If you can find something that you're interested in and grab a book about it, watch a video about it, do some research, I think everyone should try and learn about what they care about, and you'll be happy that you did. As you can tell by now, I think the past is ripe with lessons as long as we're willing to accept them. Concerning our own lives, if we can do some self-reflection, we can learn a lot about how we got to where we are, a lot about our tendencies as individuals, and a lot about how to make better decisions using the knowledge that we make. On a societal level, I think it's really well beyond time that we wake up to history instead of continuously making the same mistakes one generation after the next. I think the world could be a much better and more harmonious place if more of us were students of history with a genuine interest in achieving peace and prosperity for the world, rather than falling into the same stupid traps from the past. And once again, I know this is pretty idealistic, so I'll admit that, that's an accurate criticism, but that's just how I am. And even if society wants to keep being stupid and they won't wake up, you can choose to learn on your own, and undoubtedly you're going to end up benefiting in one way or another. And I'm sure you've probably experienced this before, but there's instances where there's just some random fact you learned one time and it suddenly becomes relevant in some random one-off unique situation, and you're the one who's able to answer the question. You have the information that's helpful, that everyone's like, oh, wow, that was really interesting. How'd you know that? And you're like, man, how did I know that? Huh? And you remember, oh, I read this book back then. I never thought that would actually be relevant. It would be useful in my daily life or conversation. Stuff like that happens. So it's always better to be well-informed and knowledgeable than not. You never know when that information is going to come into your advantage and you're going to be able to make use of it. But anyway, to close out the video, I feel like I was kind of all over the place a little bit in this one, but to close out the video, I want to suggest try and spend some time off your phone. Get off your phone for a little bit. Do some reading about history. Do some self-reflection. And later on, I think you're probably going to realize that that was a better use of your time. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.